All right, Balint, we see again for another round of interview with a IB business and management teacher and examiner. Thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure, Harry. It's nice to be with you again.
Today, we're going to be addressing many of the questions that IB business management students may have for their studies, especially leading up to the exams. The first question we'll start off with would be regarding the difficulty of the subject. So business management is regarded as one of the easy subjects, sometimes at H level, because they feel that they have a better chance of scoring a 7 compared to HL, bio, physics, math. However, obviously, students often fail to obtain the top grades they are hoping for. And could you give some insight as to why this might be the case?
Yes, indeed, there is such a conception about business, but I think it's important to understand some things about the subject to understand why students fail to reach a 7 very often. So business management is a subject with two very contrasting characters, two different faces, if I may say so. So on the one hand, it is a group 3 subject, which means that it has a strong basis in the humanities. So at the end of the day, when we are talking about business decisions, we are analyzing human behavior, psychology, and this is something that is suitable for students who are good at the humanities. However, business has a strong mathematical element as well, which is suited to the students who are good at maths, science, and abstract thinking. And typically, students are either good at one of these areas or the other. And it is very rare that a student is excellent in both of these areas. So this is why, although a student might find it relatively easy in terms of the content, they might still face some challenges. And another important thing about business is that it's a very practical subject. So although it is true that the content is relatively easy compared to higher level physics, biology, or mathematics, it is often the application that causes the challenges to students, both the humanities and the science-minded students. So they understand the content, they have a good knowledge and understanding of the topics, but they can't apply these well enough in the case studies in order to get a 7. So I think this is where this all comes from.
So to sum up what you have just shared with us, the group of students who are who have strength in the humanities subject will likely perform well compared to students who tend to be strong in sciences, even though business and management has some math aspects. And when you said math aspects, what kind of math are we talking about? Would it be like statistics when it comes to comparing like business performances between different companies, or?
So yeah, when it comes to the finance chapter, for example, there are lots of calculations. So students need to calculate ratios, cash flow forecast, break-even analysis, and these are tasks which are mathematical. And students need to do precise calculations, and there are also statistics. So this is something that is probably suitable for mathematically minded students, and the humanities students might find it challenging. But there is a flip side to this, that the humanities element, like the analyzing decisions qualitatively, is something that the math students might find difficult. So both types of students will find some sort of challenge in business. But this is also a kind of advantage in business, that it is exciting for all sorts of students.
Obviously, in business, we've got 5 core topics, and I'm guessing that only one of them, the finance, deal with math. So overall speaking, the math element is relatively small compared to the humanities aspect.
You may say that, but these 2 elements usually feature in combination. So even if there is a financial decision, it has to be evaluated qualitatively. And on the other hand, even when it comes to human resources, for example, there are sometimes calculations like labor turnover, which is a mathematical topic. So business is usually a combination of these 2, and they are not separated so much.
In terms of math required, do you need to go into the extent of using calculator, like not arithmetics calculation, but graphical, complicated math?
Probably not a graphic calculator, but students do use calculators, and in the exam, it's one of the compulsory equipments that students have. So there are complex calculations. For example, when it comes to a cash flow forecast, or when it comes to the ratios, students need calculators. But these are not, I mean, mathematically speaking, these are not comparable to higher level mathematics.
Of course. Okay, so moving on. So yes, business management as a subject may be easy, may not be easy, but overall, where do students lose most marks in the IB assessments?
So I would like to mention 2 areas here. Firstly, I would like to link back to the application, the question of application that I mentioned before. Students know the content well, so there is a good knowledge and understanding of the content. And it happens very often that students lose marks on the application. So although they give a good general answer, the answer is not related to the case study in substance, and the topic is not related to the actual business decision at hand. For example, a student might know what a public limited company is and the advantages and disadvantages, but they lose marks on explaining why launching a public limited company is good for that company in that specific situation explained in the case study. And this is a huge difference when it comes to marks. And the second point is that as an examiner, I noticed that students drop a lot of marks for small details, typically because they don't answer the questions precisely. To illustrate this with an example, it can happen that there is a question about a break-even analysis or a cash flow forecast, and the students do the calculations perfectly, but when it comes to the answer, they don't answer the question explicitly, or they omit, for example, the currency or a percentage, and they lose a mark. And even when it comes to a 6-mark question, losing a mark is very significant in terms of the percentages. So to sum up the answer, it's usually the application and it's the test-taking skills that causes students to lose marks.
Okay. There are a lot of international students, obviously, for whom English may not be their first language, and therefore, for those students, how much does English fluency affect performance in business and management?
Well, I have to say that it affects performance quite a lot. As I mentioned, business management has a large qualitative element. So students have to give explanations in their answers. Sometimes they have to write essays almost for 10-mark questions, and they have to write a lot in a relatively short space of time. In paper 1 or paper 2, for example, in the business management exam, students might end up writing at least 5 handwritten pages for both paper 1 and paper 2. So this means that they have very little time to phrase their answers. And that's very different from the internal assessment. For example, when they have, like, let's say, days or even weeks to edit their text. In the exam, they have to write under time pressure in English, and not only do they have to know the content very well, they have to give very structured and very specific and focused answers. And this is challenging, even if you know English very well. But if a student's English proficiency is low, then it's very hard to obtain high marks because for these reasons.
Okay, I think a lot of students who are weak in essay writing, let's say, might hesitate from choosing business and management with the fear of their general essay writing skills may not score well in answering the long answer questions of business. In terms of grading, grade rubrics, are there penalties for like grammar mistakes, punctuations, or non-fluent English, let's say?
So I think this is good news for those students that there are no such penalties. However, they do lose marks because they simply cannot finish the questions on time. Like I said, they have to write a lot under time pressure. And if they have to think a lot about how they phrase their answers or how they structure an essay, they will lose marks because they simply won't be able to finish the question. Or if they can't explain the answer in sufficient detail, they will not get marks for application. And also reading skills are very, very important when it comes to the case study. It's not enough to understand the gist, but to have good application, a student needs to understand the case study in detail, which involves reading between the lines, understanding the implications in the case study. And this is where I think students with low English proficiency need a lot of practice, but I think there are skills that if they master, they can have a good result in business despite a relatively low English fluency.
So it's not so much of the quality, essay quality, the quality of the essay written, but the timing. It's all about the speed of producing the essay, as well as the time required to comprehend the texts, case studies. Okay. All right. So coming to the end of our interview for today, what would you recommend for students to obtain top marks?
So based on what we have just said, I think it's very important to practice exam skills. This involves practicing good application and also, related to the language elements. It's actually quite easy to write these structured answers and essays if students learn so-called templates, answer templates, how to answer an evaluation question or a discussion question. If they have the strategy for answering the question, the writing skills will fall into place. I think that's very important. And of course, to look out for those small things where they drop marks. So students need to focus on answering the questions precisely, and if needed, indicate the currency, the percentage, label the charts to avoid dropping marks. And most importantly, I think students need to practice the application. So as we said, the content is relatively easy. So this is something that students can master relatively well. But the skill that they need to develop is to apply these to the case studies and to be creative in the answers. I think this is something that is a challenging business, but this is something that can make the subject fun and enjoyable because the content can manifest itself very differently in one business or another, depending on the case study. And this is something that students are encouraged to realize, that they have to kind of put themselves in the shoes of the decision makers of the business. And they have to apply the business management content very creatively and very purposefully. So this is something that they need to practice. And if they master this skill, I think business will be one of the most fun subjects for IBDP students.
I just want to briefly go back 2 steps and then revisit that topic of practicing exam style questions. Let's say we have formulated this writing strategy, the template. Let's say that a student wants to practice as much as possible. However, the mark scheme is available online. It's not easy for the student to mark him herself. What kind of resources can a student use to maximize the practice? Like sciences, the mark schemes are straightforward. Biology, long answer questions, there are clear guidelines for how to write long answer questions in biology. Business. Do we have, sorry, I'll make the question a bit clearer. Let's assume a student has written a full essay. Not sure how good this essay is. I don't know how this should be marked, how this can be marked.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So because of the qualitative element of business, as I mentioned before, the answers are not always straightforward. So there are answers when there is a calculation and there is a specific answer with the correct calculations. But when it comes to more complex questions, there are different possible answers, and the mark schemes will only include like bullet points of possible answers. For example, when it comes to the advantages and disadvantages of forming a specific type of business, you know, there are a lot of these, and there might be more that are applicable to the company in the case study, but the question only says, you know, give 2 advantages. So the students will have to pick 2. And, you know, which 2 will depend on what's more relevant to the business. And the mark scheme will maybe give 5 possible options. But it's true that it's hard to see based on the mark scheme what a good answer looks like. And for this, I think a good resource would be to look at past papers and exemplars. So look at high scoring papers where the answers are actually developed and compare those to the mark schemes. And I think this will give students a good understanding of you know, what it means to show good knowledge and understanding in addition to application. So analyzing exemplar papers, top scoring exemplar papers, I think is a good strategy.
You mean on already graded, like a grade 7 answer?
Yes, I think that these are available to teachers, to IB teachers through official IB resources. So, you know, even when it comes to internal assessments, there are exemplars like top scoring papers. And I think this exists for paper 1 and paper 2 types of questions. And it's useful to look at the question, try to answer it, and then look at a top scoring answer and compare these two and analyze the top scoring answers.
I think from the student's perspective, I think it's quite difficult for students to actually request school teacher for these resources, and which is why I believe there are platforms, communities, or even services that sell or provide these exemplar essays. Well, I guess students can find themselves these resources.
Yes, I can strongly recommend that students look for these kind of resources and support systems because, as you mentioned, they don't always get these resources from teachers, and sometimes the teachers are not precisely aware of what the expectations are and how examiners grade those papers. So it's definitely a good idea to look for these resources online.
Yeah. Okay. I think we have covered a lot of areas that students have questions on. So thank you again, Aline, for sharing your insight, and we hope to see you again in future.
You're most welcome.